Welcome back to the Horizon Knowledge Series. This is our second session on asset management and seeing the forest through the trees. For those of you who attended our last one, thank you. And to those of you who reached out after the training for further information and to answer questions, thank you. We did our best to get back to you. And if you have any questions following today's session, you can put it in the questions tab in your control panel, and they will show in a list view. We will answer all of them after, because we're making sure that we have 15 minutes of time to answer questions at the end. Once again, our host is Sean Benson. He's all set up and got his slides ready. And Sean, I'll hand it over to you so we can get started.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Today we're going to be talking about, as we said, basically simplifying. It's continuing the last session if you happen to be on it. And the title of the session, of course, is Seeing the Forest Through the Trees. And it's all about identifying assets in a big picture kind of a view, rather than looking at individual assets. And so I'm just going to make sure I get started here. Before we move forward, this is the second in a 10-part series. This particular series is looking at the Archibus asset management module. And then the next session is going to build on this session, and it's going to focus on the Autodesk Revit product. And we're going to talk about delivering a facilities information model that you're going to be using for operations rather than just a BIM model. After that, we'll cover some additional topics like preventive maintenance, capital projects, compliance, and all the other applications that Archibus kind of manages. In the session today, I'm going to start off just talking a little bit about opportunity, and then we'll talk about assets versus services, and then the steps that you typically take in Archibus to get up and set up your asset management system. So we'll start with the opportunity here. The opportunity, from my experience, is simplification. And simplification ultimately leads to your client adoption of the system. And the more people use the system, the more people you have using the system, the more accurate your system will be, and the more useful it will be. And in the case of Archibus, if you have the data that you generate with the asset management module and application ends up contributing and making capital planning, contract negotiation, operational decisions, and even the adoption easier. So the more you can focus on simplification, the better. Let me tell you a little story about why I think this is an important topic. I was dealing with a large retail client, and they ran about 3,000 retail chains across several malls in 5 different countries. And about 300 of those, about 10% of their chains, were kind of kind of a famous coffee brand, okay? And they called me up and said, hey, we've installed Archibus, we've got it set up, we've got our system ready to go, and we need to provide maintenance across all these coffee shops. The problem is Archibus isn't working. And I said, well, why is it not working? And they said, well, first of all, no one can even make a request for a broken cappuccino machine or a broken security door or a broken air conditioner. I said, well, what seems to be the problem? And they said, well, there's this Archibus screen, it's the request screen. And when I go to that screen and we try to select from the different types of problems that have been set up, and these are the problems that we talked about in the previous session, he said that the screen won't even load. I said, well, that does sound like a problem, because the screen should be able to load all your issues. So I said, just show me what you're talking about. And so they went ahead and they looked at the Archibus request screen. When we filled out the username or the requester name, the information, the location of the request, and we got to this problem screen, and we clicked on the drop down, and the drop down didn't load, just like they had said. So of course that's an issue. But then I kind of dug into why it wasn't loading, and I said, well, wait a second. How many different types of issues do you have are you trying to load for the customer? And they told me about 750. So they had about 750 different types of problems that could go wrong in the coffee shop. And I said, well, who is the customer? Who's making this request? Because this is a lot to consider. And they said, oh, it's the barista, whoever's working at the store. If there's a problem with the blender, or there's a problem with the cappuccino machine, or there's a problem with the door, they're the ones who are going to be using the system. And I said, wait a second, you want your baristas working at a coffee shop to log into a system like Archibus and select from the appropriate problem from a list of 750 problems. And they said, yeah. I said, well, don't you see there's a problem here, okay? And basically over that course of that day, what we had talked about was how we can get away from the 750 and get it down to something that someone can request in the course of 30 seconds or 1 minute. And it took about 3 or 4 hours for us to figure out what that list should be. But ultimately, we went from 750 different options of things that can go wrong in a coffee shop to about 25. And that was the 25 was the final list that we had kind of agreed on. So what was the problem? Well, the problem is the same problem that I see everywhere I go when people set up their asset management system. They let the operational team or the facilities team decide what the different problems are with what goes on in a coffee shop, right? Rather than look at it from the point of view of a service or the service that you're providing your customer, the customer's point of view. And what they had done was they had not only they had 750 problems, but they had 250 problems in English, 250 problems in Polish, and 250 problems in Russian, because those were the languages that they were working in. So they were working across multiple countries, and they had listed all these things together in one list. And I said to them, how can you possibly expect someone working in a coffee shop when a cappuccino or a blender breaks down to find the right request? And they said, oh yeah, well that's right, because the second problem we have is that the customer never picks the right problem, and we have to always approve every single request that goes in. We have to do research and so on and so forth. So you could guess how that kind of went from there. So this is kind of the worst end of the spectrum in terms of simplifying your Archibus system, but it does define the same problem that almost everyone has, which is you get caught up in the weeds, the details of operations and maintenance, and you don't think about the important things and how to get to the customer and how to get information from the customer to you oftentimes. So for example, if what we're going to talk about now is, what is the asset, what are the details of an asset versus the details of the service you're providing. You do have to break them apart and think about them separately when you're setting up the system. So what had happened when they set up their Archibus asset management system to resolve problems at the coffee shops is when they thought about kitchen equipment, they thought about the coffee blender, they thought about the coffee roaster, the microwave, the freezer door, the cabinet. They thought about the shutter door for the mall. And within the coffee blender, they realized that a bunch of things could go wrong. The touch screen that was being used, the chassis, the mechanics, the hydraulics, the brew, the steam system, the electronics, and so on. So they knew there was 10 or 15 different things that could go wrong with the coffee blender. And when they presented that to the barista, they were asking the barista to figure out what the problem was. Well, of course, the barista has no idea. They don't know what these different things are. They just know something's not working. So what we have to do is not think about the technical details when we set up Archibus, but first think about the service that you're offering. And so what a user knows is some basic information, like for example, they can differentiate between kitchen equipment, air conditioning equipment, or doors and security. So if you simplify the menu for them, they'll be able to get at a more accurate issue that you're providing them. And that's the common theme that I see running across every client, is that we set up the system based on the technical aspects rather than the client-facing services. So in any facility system, in any asset management system, regardless of whether you're setting up Archibus or not, you have to think about, what is the service you're providing and who is the recipient of that service. So in Archibus, and just like any other system, there are service types that you're providing. For example, most of us are thinking about reactive maintenance or reactive services, which means you're responding to a customer request or customer complaint. But there's also regular corrective services, preventive services, inspections, and assessments that we provide. And all of those generally are provided against a series of systems. And we talked a little bit about systems in the first session. The HVAC systems, air conditioning, plumbing, electrical, the conveyance systems, elevators and escalators, fire protection and security systems, and the list kind of goes on. But within each system, and this is in every building in the world, there are kind of certain component types: air handler units, rooftop units, split units, fan coil units, etc. And then within those component types, there are the individual assets that we have to manage. For example, a Trane air handler unit, which has a serial number, a model number, an installation date, and everything else. So there's a lot of information that we end up getting into and that we want to have available to us, to our technicians when they're going out and doing maintenance. The thing is, we have to keep in mind, what do the technicians need versus what do the management need versus what does the customer need. So in Archibus, we have an application called Asset Management, which is designed for keeping track of all of this detailed inventory. And Asset Management is designed for inventorying building systems, assemblies, and the components that we're talking about. And setting them up, it only isn't very complicated. It only takes 3 steps that I recommend. And there's a couple of additional steps that you can go through as well if you want to go into more detail. But all we have to do in Archibus is something called define a classification standard, define equipment standards, and then define the actual assets themselves, which are all the components within the systems. And those in Archibus, equipment represents not just systems, but also the assemblies that make up the systems and the components. So everything is a record in the same data table. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But first, I want to reiterate the issue here. The issue is when we talk about assets and we look at asset data, we often get into the trees, right? We see hundreds of thousands of data records, each with its own serial numbers, each with its own materials, with its own manufacturer, information about model types, loads, condition indicators, and so on. And so we try to keep track of that, and we kind of get wrapped into that. And human beings have a tendency to try to get all that detail into their system. But the reality is very few of us are going to really need to get at that kind of detail. So one of the things I kind of recommend to most of my clients is think about not the details of the assets, but the service you're providing. And when you set up Archibus around the service, because there are a lot of little pieces and views and reports in Archibus, and they're not all going to have every single piece of information that you want on the screen. So it's important that you set up the system in a way that you'll easily be able to filter or look up what you're looking for. And identifying the services is the way that we got from 750 problems at the coffee shops down to 25. We realized from the customer perspective and even from our own contracting and planning perspectives that the services are actually limited that you're providing. So for example, I've started writing over several years this list, and I've come up with a list of really 18 items. There's a few more that I have, and if you come to our training classes, I kind of get into more detail on the different types of services and the different components within a system. But basically, just about every client I ever go to has contributed to this list here. And what you can see is that we can simplify the components or assets that are in a system based on a series of about 18 systems, right? And I've numbered the systems 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I've given each one a prefix, a 2-letter prefix, FNST. And what I'm basically recommending here is that a lot of what you do when you set up Archibus should revolve around these prefixes. You set up a series of prefixes that most people will be able to easily learn or remember and then use to get around the system and look up the system and report on different items in the system. So for example, we've got foundations. In any building system, there are foundations. There are structural systems, steel and concrete, right? There's the HVAC or the air conditioning systems, plumbing systems, electrical systems. Some people group all these 3 into a mechanical system, right? And they have mechanical teams to respond to these. But there's also elevators and escalators, fire safety systems, IT, security, civil services. You call them what you want. Everyone calls them something slightly different, and everyone organizes them slightly different based on the different work teams that they have. But every building and every facility has this kind of group of systems typically. Nowadays, there are also, of course, instrumentation systems that are checking on all these other systems. People are focused a little bit more on sustainability. There's some of us that have to deal with pests. And of course, there are other things like artwork or the fleet that other or specific organizations deal with. But basically, most of what we do fall into just this list. And I found that if you kind of show people this list, HV, PL, EL, FS, IT, it becomes pretty clear how how you can remember these different items. So my suggestion here is when you set up Archibus, narrow down what services you provide, identify the services, and I try to identify how you want to refer to them in the system. Do you want to use a 2-digit code? Do you want to have this information somewhere? So ultimately, when a user or a manager or a technician is looking up one of those hundreds of thousands of items and trying to identify or group them together, they can easily find them through this prefix. So here's an example. In Archibus, when you have to set up a variety of different data types to manage your assets and provide operations and maintenance. Those data types are things like the work team, the equipment standard, the equipment and PM procedure. And very simply, what I tell people sometimes is just add the prefix to the beginning of all of these things that you're doing. So if you're setting up HVAC or air conditioning, add the HV prefix to just about everything. And then when you're going back later and you're looking for all these things related to HVAC, they're all grouped together under HV. So you have HV techs, you have HV engineers, you have an HVAC chiller pump, you have an HVAC exhaust fan, you have equipment number 230001, and then you have PM procedure HV pump 12 weeks, which is a 3-month procedure. And then everything is based on that. So even your service portal, which we talked about in the last lesson, is based on those same types of processes and teams. The reason why I recommend this, the reason why I recommend setting up prefixes is because there are a variety of users who use the system, and there's a lot of different screens that don't show, the 70 different fields in Archibus that store information on assets. Most of them will show a code, most of them will show a description, most of them will show an equipment standard or a classification. So it's key that you use these 3 or 4 fields and have the information that everybody needs. And so there's a few examples here. General users who are using the workplace and have to look up an equipment, asset managers who have to filter consoles down to a specific type of equipment, PM planners who are doing the same thing, scheduling equipment, and so on. And then assessors who are generating assessments, and admins building reports that need to filter. All these people need to be able to look at not a million pieces of equipment, but they need to filter down into their 100,000 or 10,000 assets that they're responsible for managing or reporting on. And that's why it helps to kind of use this type of a breakdown. Here's an example that I actually created with a customer. I don't know if you can see it, but basically, again, it kind of goes through those same tables that we're using, work teams, trades, user portals, problem types, equipment standards, and equipment. And it kind of organizes things around that 2-digit code. So if you have a mechanical, you have office services, you have service, other types of soft services, environmental services, and so on, then you set up everything around the service. You set up the trades based on mechanical trades and office service trades, and so on. The user portal is based on, the high level is based on a mechanical problem or an environmental problem, and it drills into, a breakdown of those things. The problem type is organized by the code, and then so are the equipment standards. So an ME screen cam is a mechanical security camera under the HVAC system or whatever it might be. And then all of your equipment, for example, if you want to use the 2-digit code for equipment, that comes in handy as well. Otherwise, you can use your standard kind of numeric equipment codes, and you put something like this in the description. So at least you can, even though you don't have that in the code, you can identify or search on all of your equipment that's electrical or air conditioning or whatever it might be. And that's how we've set up some of our clients. So let's talk a little bit, let's actually walk through what it takes to set up this kind of a system in Archibus, so that you can make sure that no matter who you are and what screen you're looking at, you'll be able to identify very quickly a group of equipment and find it easily. So again, we're going to look at three basic steps here: defining classifications for your equipment, defining equipment standards, defining equipment. Now, when I say equipment, I'm really talking about any asset at all. So remember, equipment is an Archibus term that refers to records in a specific data table that can be maintained. You might keep doors, you might keep furniture, you might keep cars, you might keep boats in the equipment table, you might keep light bulbs in the equipment table. It all depends on how you manage and what service you're providing. But equipment is the term that we use to look at all these things. So there's a couple of extra steps, like actually putting all this equipment into the systems that they belong to, and defining additional types of values, fields, attributes for every type of equipment. I can show you those if there's time, but ultimately, most of us who are going to be using Archibus will have to set up a classification, a standard, and then the individual assets themselves. So at this point, I'm going to hop over into the product and show you where this happens. So I'm going to log in. Let's pretend I'm an asset manager, and my responsibility is to set up asset equipment in Archibus. I know I've got potentially hundreds of thousands of equipment records that I need to import into the system in order to maintain them and set up preventive maintenance schedules and so on. And so what do I have to do to prepare? Well, the first thing I do is I go in and I set up classifications. Now, classifications are under the background data assets menu. And the reason they're important is because number one, they show up in a lot of different reports and forms in Archibus. But number two, they allow us to kind of easily filter and report on either industry standard classifications or our own Archibus classification. So for example, as you can see on my screen, I've got a couple different classifications. There's a master format, which is an industry standard used for mapping or classifying assets. And then there is one called OmniClass, and there's a variety of these. These can be imported directly into Archibus to set up and report on assets versus the versus these standards. And the nice thing in Archibus is you can actually assign each asset to 4 different classifications if you want. So you can use all of these as ways to classify your equipment. And what I always kind of let people know is, one of the things you can do is create your own. So for example, if you wanted to click on add and add a new top level, I have one here called Archibus. You can just type in Archibus, and what you end up with is a new classification. In this case, it's your organizational classification that we're going to be using for Archibus. And once you do that, you can add another classification to Archibus. And this is where you might come in and say, well, I want to be able to filter everything on all my HVAC equipment. So you type in something like HVAC, or you type in your prefix HV, and this is going to be your HVAC equipment. And you save this. And now you start building that classification. So again, we're going to add another one. We're going to add a new classification. This might be EL, and that's all of your electrical equipment. And now, if you ever get to a screen where you have an option to search by classification, what this is going to allow you to do is search and filter on all of your electrical equipment or all of your HVAC equipment. So you can manage that by the classification. We can even, if you wanted to, set up roles for your mechanical engineers or your electricians and have them log into the system and filter by classification, and that way they only see the equipment that they see. Again, we're trying to simplify the use of the system for each user type that's logging in. But that's how you set up classifications. And the first thing is just to simply go in and add those in and so on. There's an option here, as you can see, for importing and exporting classifications. So there's obviously you can set these up in Excel and import them in so that you can use them pretty easily. The second step, after we get that kind of basic industry or Archibus classification in the system, is to identify the important types of equipment types that you want to be servicing. And this isn't, what's important here is to identify not just the individual components, down to the manufacturing model, but the basic kind of archetype that you're looking for. Air handler unit, this is an archetype, right? There's lots of different models, there's lots of different types of air handler units, but when it comes to reporting at the end of the day, when it comes to planning for regular scheduled procedures, do you need to know every single detail about every single asset, or do you just need to know the basic archetype for it for reporting purposes? And so I always say, look, try to start as simply as possible with these standards that we set up, because they do show up everywhere in Archibus, and the more detailed you get, the less useful your reports are going to be, because there's going to be so much information on each report. Standards are a way of classifying things in Archibus for kind of simplified reporting of what is ultimately going to be hundreds of thousands of different assets. So the standards are your way of helping to simplify. And again, setting up a standard is pretty simple. You again just kind of choose to add a standard, and this way, again, instead of just typing in air handler unit like they've done in the example down below, I'm going to type in HV dash, and then every single thing, every single piece, and every single asset that I create within the HVAC system is going to begin with HV, and then I'll add my AHU. So I have a pretty strict kind of standard around starting with that 2-digit prefix to identify the system, then using a 3 or 4-digit code for the standard, and then a 3 or 4-digit code for the type of standard. So for example, oftentimes we'll get HV, and then I'll have a PMP for pump, but you want to know what kind of pump it is. Oh, it's a chiller pump. So if you come to, again, my asset training, we talk a little bit about all the different options you have, but I've actually kind of codified the different standards that I use to identify different types of equipment. And things like pumps should be consistent throughout, because you don't have pumps just in HVAC systems. You've got other pumps in other systems, and you want to make sure that you're building a system that people can remember and come back to and filter on. So you want to be fairly consistent about how you generate these equipment standard names so that you can use them throughout and not have to remember which way, you know, a pump was spelled for electrical or HVAC or whatever it might be. Now, in addition to the standard itself, right, the actual code, of course, you want to put in a description, and any other information is useful. But like I always tell most people in Archibus, again, because most people like to overcomplicate things, they'll look at all of these different fields and they'll try to fill out every single classification, all the standard width, depth, height, manufacturer, model number, standard price, and so on. Don't do that. Just because a field exists in Archibus doesn't mean you have to use it. Only use it if you have a specific need. And I know what happens when people use Archibus is they look at this standard and they say, standard includes manufacturer, model number, and standard price. But you know what? Ignore that. Model number, manufacturer, serial number, and price, those are all specific to assets you've purchased. And those fields exist in the equipment table. So don't fill those fields out when you create standards. They're originally in Archibus. They weren't originally part of the equipment table, but several years ago, those fields were added into the equipment table. So there's no longer a need to get that detailed. You can keep the standard quite simple at a high level and just identify the standard, the description, the classification, and that's about it at the beginning. You know, as you see the need, a reporting need for more detail, then make another standard for it, right? So for high priority items, high price items, like rooftop units, for example, you might want to have multiple standards for different types of rooftop air handler units, but don't make a different standard for every single door that you have. Don't make a standard for every single cappuccino maker that you have, you know, unless your business is cappuccino machines. So these are the things you have to think about. Remember, the theme of today is simplification. So don't get into too much detail. Don't have too many standards. And I say this again, I walked into a customer in New York City. They had 6,000 assets. They had 2,000 standards for those assets. So I said, well, what's the point of 2,000 standards if you have only 6,000 assets? You can't use that for any kind of useful reporting. And again, they said, oh yeah, where were you, when we started a couple of years ago? So again, start simple. Don't use it if you don't need it, and then when you need the detail, that's where the equipment comes in. So the next and the third step is to set up your actual equipment. Now there's several different views where you can modify equipment. Things like the asset lifecycle console is a nice view to use for equipment, but there's also there is also the view called where is it here? Manage assets, manage equipment and standards. This is a nice view, and if you don't see it on your menu, it's the file that is called ABESS-def-EQ. If you click on this, it's kind of nice because again, it kind of organizes the view by standard, and then what you can do is you can set up your equipment by standard. So again, all you have to do, like everything else in Archibus, is press the add button and fill out the details that you need. And again, if you want to have an equipment that's called 1001, that's perfectly legitimate and that's great. But if you have a chance and it makes sense, you can also use that same HV prefix to be able to kind of, again, give yourself another way to focus on that being an HVAC piece of equipment. There's a whole discussion around what we should use for equipment codes in Archibus. Personally, I happen to like numeric identifiers. If you can throw in the prefix, okay, that's fine. I tend to stay away from adding the building within the equipment code, because oftentimes our Archibus clients change building names, so they change the building code. So it's tough to do that. But again, if you have a fixed asset, that's fine too. So again, think simply here. After equipment code, you need some basic information. You need your classification, you need your standard. That's what Archibus wants. You probably need to know the model number and serial number so you can find, so you can map this to an operation manual and a preventive maintenance schedule. You need to know the location, for example, and then of course there's all the other information on these tabs that you need to fill out for creating your system. But basically, only do what you need. This is the key about asset management Archibus. Only focus on the customer, focus on your management and what the reporting requirements are, and then focus on operationally what information do you need to go out and do your job and maintain these assets every single day. And those are the 3 steps you kind of want to take to set up your equipment. Now, the reason I showed you the managed equipment and standards view is because there is a nice little feature here for printing QR labels. So if you want to use Archibus for printing labels and barcoding things, nowadays there's some nice features and nice apps that use the QR labels. You can actually very quickly select the equipment that you want to print labels for and print QR labels, and they basically print out a Word document that you'll put into your label printer and then print your labels for. So this is a nice little feature on the manage equipment and standards screen. Ultimately, what's going to determine whether you've set up your system properly is when the evaluation that you do. So the last step, of course, is evaluating the system that you've set up. And for that, you'll use reports and forms like the Asset Lifecycle Console, which is basically a view into your asset system. So you have, of course, here, I'm going to simplify the screen for you just by losing some of what I would consider the details. But here you can see your assets, a reporting system in Archibus allows you to look at assets in terms of land or structures, buildings themselves, what we call equipment, and then furniture. Now, like I said, you might have furniture in the equipment table. It depends on your implementation. But basically, if you want to focus on equipment, you'll be able to look at your equipment. You'll filter based on, as you can see, the classification, the standard, who's responsible for that equipment, what Archibus calls the custodian, the location, and so on. And the nice thing about a form like this is you can flip from one tab to the next. For example, I can go from the registry form where I add equipment to the optimization form and take advantage again of some of the kind of capabilities of this form. So for example, on this form, we can see some basic portfolio metrics being identified for all assets, your asset turnover, facility condition index across the assets that are filtered on the form, annual utilization rates, statistics here in terms of conditions and status, total count, total owned cost to replacement cost, current purchase price, and so on. So this type of summary data allows you to drill into some of the details. But if you haven't built in the forest before you get to the trees, it's going to be tough to kind of really understand where is your money going, how are you spending your time on different types of assets. So again, the idea is think about the different users you have, your management who are trying to make capital planning decisions, the users who are trying to make requests for equipment that they need to have fixed, and yourselves who need to understand how to fix a particular piece of equipment, what's the appropriate steps for the preventive maintenance procedure, and ultimately, how do you find that equipment? Because you're going to end up with not just hundreds or thousands, but oftentimes tens of thousands of equipment in one area, and each group is going to be responsible for that. So I'm trying to cover kind of the basic steps. Set up your classifications, set up your standards, set up the equipment, and then evaluate this on a regular basis. And this should get you started with the asset management system in Archibus. And once you've done that and you've identified these systems, going into different areas like the reactive maintenance in Archibus and preventive maintenance, setting up your building information model, these all become much clearer and easier and simpler and make the system simpler to use. So I think everyone should see the slides again. So just to summarize for today, the goal with Archibus Asset Management for you should be to simplify the way that you use the system. And you simplify it by viewing all of those assets through the service that you provide to the customer and then the services that are being reported on to your management. evaluate how you're doing, evaluate how well that's working for you, and then make your adjustments as needed. And ultimately, you're going to be able to produce reports that will help justify capital planning, contracting decisions, and then even your operational decisions. And more importantly, it's going to make Archibus much faster to use because everyone's going to understand where to look to find their air handler units or their chairs and tables or their fleet and vehicles and so on. Okay. Okay, I hope this was kind of a quick and brief and useful view of Archibus. As we said today, we wanted to just take a look at how to get up and running with the asset management application by seeing the forest through the trees through the lens of services. In the next session, which is in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about delivering a facility information model rather than just a building information model and what the difference is. So it's going to focus not on Archibus, but on the Revit model that we ask for from our contractors. And then we'll continue on with sessions on BIM and preventive maintenance and so on. So now I think we want to have a good 10 or 15 minutes of question and answers for those of you who have been keeping track of the questions that you may have. And I will turn it over to Iain to propose those questions.
Thank you, Sean. So like you said, if anyone has any questions they've been sitting on for the training session, you can put them in the questions tab, or if it's a longer form question that you want answered by a member of our team, my email is right there, as well as Kelly Welch's. You can send them to us, and then we can get in contact with the members of our team and get an answer to you. And Maureen Reed, can the slides from each of these presentations be shared with the participants? Yes, Maureen, they will be shared with the participants. We are ironing out some logistics of it, but you will receive the slides in the following this training today, as well as in the future ones as well. And I know Sean, you will have the slides ready as well to send to me so I can share them. If there's anyone, are there any other questions?
The slides, we'll provide the slides, and what you didn't see was for each step that we went through in the live environment, we have a slide that kind of indicates the navigational menu, as well as just a screenshot of that view.
Yes, it will include the first presentation as well. If there are any more in-depth questions on the training regarding assets, or if they're more, like I said, if they're more long-form ones you or your team want answered, you can send them to either of our emails and we can contact our team. I think we're going to give it a couple more minutes for questions. I know they usually takes a couple minutes to roll in. That was great, Sean. Thank you. Not seeing any more questions roll through at the moment. So in that case, we can wrap up, and I will make sure to distribute all of the slides to everybody as well, and send out an email to everybody to make sure that you all get them accordingly. Thank you for joining us again, and keep an eye out for the invite to the next training session as well in 2 weeks, like Sean said, on facilities information modeling. Thank you, and we'll see you all next time.